Hi booktube, Aaron here. Hope you're doing very well. Today I'm going to talk about the books that I finished in July, and then I'll go into some of my reading plans for August. July was a very good reading month, and luckily I had some time off to with no real plans on the whole, so I was just able to sort of chill out with my wife and my daughter, and um, there were some sort of lovely, sort of relaxed mornings where, as my daughter was napping, I was able to sit and read for a little bit, and then just some sort of nice, sort of relaxed evenings as well, where there were no real obligations the next day, so I could just sit reading as well. So I was able to get a fair bit done, um, and I enjoyed a lot of what I read as well. The first couple of books I'll share with you, I don't have too much to talk about since they've already been mentioned. I feel like I've already said about all I have to say about them for the time being. The first is Clea, the fourth book in Laurence Durrell's Alexandria Quartet, and I've made a video about the whole quartet, and I'd quite like to read the whole thing, the whole quartet again at some point, but I'll give it a bit of time. But I really enjoyed it, and I really enjoyed where he took it, where Durrell took the quartet in Clea. And the next book that I finished was an audiobook. I don't listen to too many audiobooks, but I'm sort of experimenting. I have been over the last few months. And I listened to an audiobook by Harold Bloom called The Bright Book of Life. It's a book about a series of novels that resonated with him, that he was constantly rereading, and that he felt were important. So it's quite similar to this book, How to Read and Why, but it's just more focused on novels. I'm sure if I reread How to Read and Why, I might find that in certain points probably he probably repeats himself a bit. But I enjoyed it. I wouldn't recommend it if you were looking at the books that he mentions in there and you wanted a kind of one-stop guide to that book. It wouldn't be the best place to go. I don't think. He's quite idiosyncratic. He goes down his own rabbit holes. However, in their own digressive and idiosyncratic way, he is still insightful. But yeah, not necessarily the first place to go if you're, seeing that he's talking about Don Quixote and Pride and Prejudice and Mrs. Dalloway and whatever. Then, yeah, there might be some other places you might want to try first. And then I read a book for Historathon. I forgot to mention I wanted to read this in the last wrap-up video that I made. But this is Heretics and Heroes, How Renaissance Artists and Reformation Priests Created Our World. It's by Thomas Cahill, and it's the sixth book in his Hinges of History series, where he's looking at certain periods of history, and really, instead of looking at how, who killed who took over from who married who had who beheaded, and all of that stuff. Instead, he's looking at these periods of history, looking at the culture and the politics, and then he's trying to see what gifts these periods have for our present and how they've shaped us and inspired us. And so that's very much what he seemed to be doing here. And the biggest gift, it seemed to me, through both Renaissance arts in Italy and then sort of later on in the north with Bruegel and with Albrecht Dürer and people like that, and then also through the politics and the Reformation with Luther and people who followed him, people who detracted from him, with people like Erasmus. you get this sort of development and this refinement of the idea of the individual. And at least for me, that was the most exciting thing about this book. As I said, he's very much sort of funneling all of this into the present day. And certainly towards the end of the book, at least for me, I felt like he was maybe focusing on the present at least too much. But maybe again, that is more of a reflection on my expectations for the book and sort of what I wanted to get out of it, I suppose. But I still enjoyed it, and I haven't read the rest of the Hinges of History books as well. So again, that's something that is going to impact the way that I see it, the expectations I'm going to have. But there was part of me that just wished that he sort of dug a little deeper, that there was a little more detail, because certainly when it came to the life and impact of people like Albert Dürer, about Martin Luther, I was really not getting much more than I'd already got from cultural osmosis, really, and so yeah, there were certainly other places to go, but for what it was, I really enjoyed Heretics and Heroes. And then I read this next book as a buddy read with Alan from Big Hard Books and Classics. This is Going to Meet the Mann by James Baldwin. I think maybe one of the first times I've read a collection of short stories as a buddy read, which I found really enjoyable. It was a fun way to sort of check in after every story or every couple of stories, and it also sort of kept me thinking about what the collection was like as a whole, how the stories worked together. Yeah, it was an enjoyable experience to go through it with Alan. Yeah, it was my introduction to James Baldwin. I haven't read anything by him before. I was already familiar with the title story. I'd heard it on the History of Literature podcast. Every now and then, they'll do an episode where the host Jack Wilson will sort of read the story, and we'll sort of pause partway through, and there'll be sort of commentary on the story and stuff like that. And so I was already familiar with the title story, very disturbing story about brutalization, about racism in the Deep South, in the sort of 1950s, I think it's set. The rest of the stories, with the exception of one or two others, they have more of a focus on Black communities and on what it was like as a Black person in America, but also elsewhere. I suppose what it was like to be a Black American, just generally, in the sort of mid 20th century. And I really loved it. I loved his writing. There's a story in here called Sonny's Blues that both me and Alan really enjoyed. It's about the main character is a teacher, fairly respectable, fairly settled, but his brother has had trouble with drug addiction, but he's also a musician. He also plays piano, and he loves jazz music, and it's sort of about blues and about finding meaning through music, and sort of taking all of your pain and everything that life has thrown at you, taking all of your sort of mistakes, all of your regrets, and trying to create something out of that. So it had some of the best writing on music in there that I've ever read. This was a wonderful scene at the end of the story about this brother going to, about our protagonist going to watch his brother play piano in a jazz club, and it's just some of the best writing on music I've ever read. The next story in the collection after that, this evening, so soon, about a he's the main character. He's an actor and a singer, and he's moved out to Paris and has sort of made it as, he's been in some films and he's sung in some clubs and has done well. And I think he feels like he has a bit more freedom in Paris, where he's been living as a black person. He's um, got a relationship with a woman there, and he's got a son, um, and yet, just because of work, because of sort of the pull of Hollywood and opportunity, he's been pulled back to America. And it's about his sort of dread of going back, and how differently he's seen over there. It was a really, I thought, really profound and quite moving story. Moving on, um, I read New Selected Stories by Thomas Mann, translated by Damien Searles. Really enjoyed this. Although I really enjoy Thomas Mann, it's the first thing that I've read of his that isn't The Magic Mountain. I decided to pick this up because at the same time, Classics and Company, a sort of reading event to read classics throughout the year, are reading Magic Mountain this month, just gone, and so I didn't really want to read The Magic Mountain a third time so soon after the last two times I read it, and so I decided to read this instead, and really enjoyed it. But there are two stories in here that were really quite intriguing, because, well, I should say, it says on the cover New Selected Stories. It doesn't say short stories. Only one of these stories are short, and that's called Louise, which is a really odd story. But there are two stories in here that, they're not short stories at all. They're excerpts from novels. There's A Day in the Life of Hanno Buddenbrook, which is from Buddenbrooks, and then there's Confessions of a Con Artist by Felix Krull, just part one, My Childhood. That story was published sort of on its own, but then Mann kept coming back to it, adding to it, and it eventually became a novel. A Day in the Life of Hanno Buddenbrook, I think just people have always thought that it works well as a short story, and so this title is just what Damien Searles gave it, since it's just an excerpt from a novel, and that was actually my favourite part. It's also got Death in Venice in it, which is brilliant, and I can certainly see why it's got the reputation that it's got. But there's something about A Day in the Life of Hanno Buddenbrook, which is a very simple story about a boy from a prestigious family going to school. He's totally unprepared, has done none of his homework, and that's it. That's the story. And there's just something about it that was really comforting, and I just relished it. So I'm really intrigued. And although I've been saying recently I'd quite like to read Dr. Faustus by Thomas Mann next, I think I might read Buddenbrooks next, just based on how that story related and sort of resonated with me. Next up, a couple of poetry books, and I'll try not to go on too long with these. We've got the Voronezh notebooks by Osip Mandelstam, which I really loved. It took a while to get used to them, I think, and to sort of get what he was doing, but I really enjoyed them. I sort of read a couple initially, put it down. A few days later, read a couple more poems, and then I think by the third sitting, I could barely stop myself from reading them. So really loved them. Really vital and subversive in places. Just and sometimes there's just a sort of ironic economy to what he's doing. So there's this little bit here in one of the poems. He says, today angels, tomorrow maggots, and the next day only faintest sketch. What was a step, it will end beyond us. Immortal flowers, the sky a single dome, and all that will be only promise. That's actually how it ends. That's the last lines of the last poem in the notebooks, and I just loved it. It sort of reminds me of Rilke at times, but much funnier and much more lively, and much more vital. And so yeah, I'd like to read some more Mandelstam at some point. And I also read Nobody by Alice Oswald, which is kind of a reworking of the Odyssey, a retelling, and it's kind of not. She talks about how before going off to the Trojan War, Agamemnon um, hires a poet to spy on his wife, and instead another man who wants to have an affair with Agamemnon's wife takes the poet and rows him out to this to a stony island out in the middle of nowhere. Rows back and goes off and has an affair with Agamemnon's wife, and then when Agamemnon comes back from Troy, he's then murdered by his wife. And so instead of really focusing on Odysseus, who takes longer getting home than Agamemnon, who's sort of blown all over the place and goes off course. Instead, it's maybe imagining a poem that a poet on a stony island may have heard glimpses of, little snippets here and there on the wind, but it's not quite the whole story of the Odyssey. It goes off course, and other stories from Greek mythology that are sort of hinted at throughout the Odyssey sort of come in. So it was really intriguing. It's really focused on the sea and on how changeable the sea is. There were also moments here. I wish I'd sort of marked some of the moments that I think she is kind of doing what she does in Memorial, at least sometimes. In her poem Memorial, she's excavating the Iliad and she's just taking the similes. And every now and then, there's a simile or a metaphor that she uses that strikes a chord and just reminds me of a moment in the Odyssey, such as there's a moment when Odysseus is he's at somebody's table. He's the guest of this king, and the king has a poet who's singing about the sacking of Troy, and Odysseus just breaks down crying. And the simile that's used it's I think it's about, if I remember correctly, it says he's crying like a woman who's just lost her child, or something, something like that, something as profound and as heartbreaking as that. And there are just one or two moments where she's sort of using similar similes that aren't exactly the same, but that they're just sort of hinting at it. And so there are these sort of faint echoes of the Odyssey throughout it, but then it's very much doing its own thing. So I really loved it. I really enjoyed it. There's no punctuation, which won't always when you sort of think of it like that, it's can be off-putting, and I can sometimes be a little skeptical of that kind of experimentation, although I have sort of tried it myself. And what I like about the way Alice Oswald does it, and what I sort of try to do when I experiment with it, is instead of just removing punctuation to be weird or to make it harder, instead it's there to get you to slow down, and it's there to get you to pay attention to what the language is doing, and that was really, really wonderful. Yeah, I really loved this, and probably the highlight of the month for me. Then two more. There's The Fraud by Zadie Smith. My first ever Zadie Smith. I think her first ever work of historical fiction. It's set during the Victorian period. It's about a guy claiming to be, I'm just trying to remember the name, a man trying to be Sir Roger Tichborne, and there's a trial going on because this guy claiming to be Roger Tichborne doesn't seem to act like him, doesn't seem to have his education, and he's sort of claiming for the inheritance since the matriarch of the family's died, but the rest of the family, don't believe that it's actually the real Sir Roger, who they believe is lost at sea. And so there's this trial about it, and somehow there's this charisma around this guy claiming to be Sir Roger. And I think particularly the working classes sort of rally around him and really believe it's true. So that's kind of the main narrative sort of going on. It's told sort of mainly from the perspective of kind of over the shoulder of a housekeeper called Mrs. Touchet, who is the housekeeper for a novelist called, I think, William Ainsworth, I believe. Yeah, and he was a real writer, and this trial was a real trial. She's taken some liberties with it, and sort of gone off in some other directions, but they're inspired by real events and real people. Ainsworth was a contemporary of Dickens, kind of a forgotten author, and there are kind of passages from some of his novels in there which are quite entertaining, because they're not really very good. So it's sort of about her and her growing fascination with this trial, and about her relationship to this author that she's been keeping house for. She's very, she's got a history with this guy. She's got a history with this man's past wife, who's since died. She was very attached to her, and then she's very involved in the sort of current family life as well. And so these two elements of the story kind of sort of meld together, and the way she's been so close to this writer, seeing how this own writer's fictions have influenced the public, because he was quite popular in his day, kind of informs how she's able to see the trial and able to see how the kind of storytelling going on in this trial, this kind of fraud, this fabrication, is kind of connected to how a novelist can influence people. It keeps sort of folding in on itself in that kind of way, which I found really intriguing. The thing I appreciated the most in The Fraud was the prose style on the whole for sort of the main sort of narration of the story. It doesn't feel particularly Victorian to me. It seems quite contemporary, which I mean in a good way. And yet the characterization, and particularly the dialogue, although it doesn't completely feel like it's straight from a Victorian novel, I think at least evokes enough of the Victorian world. And so there's that sort of happy compromise between the two that Smith seems to have been able to catch there, which I really liked. Then next up, book I just finished earlier today. It's A Man in Love by Karl over Knausgård, his second book in the My Struggle series, and I'm sort of really glad I sort of carried on with this. I think I preferred this quite a lot more to the first book, although I did enjoy the first book. And the first book is more about his childhood, and then sort of contrasting that with him being a bit older, and hearing about the death of his father, and just dealing with the practicalities of his father's funeral and stuff like that, and reassessing his relationship to his father through that and stuff like that. In this book, it's, as the title may suggest, about him and his wife, at least his his current wife, as he was writing these books. I think they've since divorced, and about how he first met her when he was married to somebody else, and then that relationship a few years later it sort of crumbles. He decides to move from Norway to Sweden, to Stockholm, and he only knows two people there, one of whom is Linda, this woman who will eventually become his wife. And so it's just charting the story of their relationship, of their friends. The structure of it is really interesting. It starts in sort of the near present for him as he's writing. He's married to Linda. They have kids. About the sort of the routines and the daily battles of parenthood, and then it sort of sinks back further in time, step by step, and then as he sort of got to as far back as he wants to go, it sort of builds itself back up again. So it's more or less, but yeah, I really appreciated that, and I'm sort of coming to understand what he's doing here as well. Everyone, when they talk about Knausgård, and particularly when they talk about my struggle, the word that comes up a lot is mundanity, and this sort of attention to detail, this almost mind-numbing attention to detail that can be quite hypnotic. And I actually quite appreciate it, quite enjoy it in a weird and almost masochistic way. And but I don't think the book's really about that, and I think the reason he's so focused on it is because he's sort of trying to express how that stuff can take over and how it sort of empties everything else out of your mind. Because then there are these moments where he gets time alone, he gets time to write, he gets time to read, and suddenly the whole narrative breaks down and sort of turns into an essay about whatever it is he's thinking about death, about Renaissance art, about anything. But it's just incredible, and there are other moments where that comes through, where he manages to have a really good conversation with a friend as well. And it's about how just the day-to-day tasks that you have to do as a responsible adult, um, sort of jostle up and are fighting for space against all of these other preoccupations, and against his life as a writer and as an intellectual, and so it's really interesting, and I've been really enjoying that. And also in this volume in particular as well, I quite enjoyed his exploration of what it's like to be somewhere where he doesn't quite know the culture. It's sort of close to Norway, but also Sweden it's quite different in some significant ways. There are differences in language and things like that, and so there's also the challenges of how he has to negotiate that, which I really enjoyed. And then very quickly, we've got some of the books I'm currently reading, and I've just got 3 books then, sort of as well as those that I'd like to get to next month. I've found that I think when I keep my plans for the next month relatively light, it sort of gives some room for for improvisation. So what I'm reading at the moment, after finishing Knausgård, I picked up The Leopard by Giuseppe de Lampedusa. Quite enjoying it so far. It's about Sicily in the sort of mid to late 19th century, sort of in the period of Garibaldi. So you've got sort of these liberals sort of rebelling against royalists, and the main character here is a prince in Sicily, and so there's sort of that going on, and I think there seems to be a fair bit of tension within his household, and but really I've just sort of got to know him as a character so far, and he's an interesting character. So far, the best character is his dog, though. But it's been good so far, and I think I'm going to enjoy it. I've been carrying on with Paradise by Dante. I think I'm almost approaching the halfway point of Paradise. I've been trying to go slow, but not too slow. But I seem to be getting a bit more out of it. So plenty of good notes in here. So I'm sort of going into each canto, and I'm sort of able to take my time with it and work out what's going on. And I'm following footnotes where I can. And I've also sort of started watching Thomas's videos as well, from Tom LA Books. He's made a great series on the Divine Comedy, and I've been finding his perspective helpful as well. And then I, for some reason, decided it was the right time to pick up On the Nature of the Universe by Lucretius. I think really the kind of poem that this is, it's kind of fighting for space with Paradise. And so I think I might pause this until I finish Paradise. And it's essentially a explanation of Epicureanism, a particular branch of philosophy that's really very much rooted in the here and now. Going back to Dante, he puts the Epicureans in hell because they don't believe in an afterlife. And so I think, rather ironically, they're left to sort of burn eternally inside graves, which is, a kind of sick sense of humour, I suppose. And it's just an explanation of this theory. There's a kind of proto-atomic theory going on here. But on the back here it says that you've got all this philosophy in here, but apparently it's supposed to have some of the best poetry ever written. And at least so far, I've read the first book. I think there are 6 books. Let's have a look. Yeah, there are 6 books. I've read book 1 before I decided to pause. And at least in the rendering of this translation, that poetry isn't really coming across. So it's more the ideas that I'm engaging with on the whole. Whereas, at least with Dante, I'm enjoying the imagery, enjoying the language where I can. And luckily, I've got the parallel translation with Dante as well, and so I'm able to do my best to read it in the original. Although I think all I can really work out are the connectives. But still, it's I'm able to sort of enjoy Dante on more levels at the moment than I'm able to enjoy Lucretius. Another book I kind of paused, but I think because of Lucretius, I want to pick up again, and that's The Complete Poems of Emily Dickinson. And so I think I'll be picking this up soon, just to get a bit more variety, have something that feels a bit closer to home in comparison to Lucretius. So they're the books that are kind of ongoing at the moment. And then 3 books for August. The first is As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. This is for Faulkner in August, an event where a load of people get together and read the works of William Faulkner. I've read this one before, so I'm looking forward to rereading it. I think I'm going to take some notes and at least try to kind of create character profiles, and because it was something I struggled with the first time I read this. And I'm probably going to wait until I've finished The Leopard before I start on that, so I might have some catching up to do with the rest of the group, but that's okay. And then once I finish The Leopard and As I Lay Dying, I'll then, I think, go on and read the next Karl Knausgård, so I'll pick up Boyhood Island, and we'll see where that goes. But yeah, I've been enjoying it, but I didn't want to jump straight in. I wanted a bit of variety before carrying on with Knausgård. And then if I finish Lucretius next month, which is quite an ask really, but if I do, then the next on my list for poetry is Don Paterson, The Arctic. It was sort of recommended the last time I brought it up. Someone said it was really wonderful and heart crushing, which sounds great. So that'll be the next poetry book I get to if I finally get through Lucretius. But that's it. And so that's everything I read in July, everything I want to read next month, or at least a kind of selection. I'm going to leave it loose, and if I read all of those and still have space, I'm kind of in the mood for, yeah, I think in the mood for kind of rereading something. Maybe something like Frankenstein or Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Something I haven't read for quite some time, but has a kind of hint of familiarity. We'll see. But yeah, for now, thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.